Amid a controversy over whether to quarantine healthcare workers returning from Ebola-stricken nations, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says it depends. The agency issued new guidelines Monday that take into account an individual's own chance of contracting the disease. The CDC says a high-risk person is someone who had a known exposure, a needle stick, or inadequate protective gear while caring for an Ebola patient. The new recommendation, a voluntary 21-day home quarantine.
New guidelines from the CDC meant to attack the Ebola virus and the accompanying panic are going into place as fast as the suits can muster them. But this brings up a larger point about more than just Ebola. How safe we feel in our hospitals and how secure we may not be in knowing such agencies have a real handle on what might come next. Welcome back to MidPoint. The former Director of Compliance and Security at Southern Research, a recognized expert on biosafety, bioterror, and bioweapons, Debra Sharpe. Debra, good to see you again.
Good to see you too, Ed.
I wanted to take you right away, first of all, to the CDC new guidelines. And of course, what stands out is they now have 4 categories as well that they're putting people in: high risk, some risk, low risk, no risk. I have to tell you, Debra, that even seeing all of these things, and the CDC says are making it better, I haven't talked to many people today who feel they're any safer today than they were a month ago, knowing that the CDC seems to be just making it up as they go along.
Yeah, and I do think it is a difficult position for CDC to be in because they are not used to setting these kinds of guidelines. And every time we have a different scenario, they're asked to respond and provide something new in the way of guidance to the American public. And yeah, it is confusing to the American public, and it is very challenging from a public health perspective for those of us that are in the field.
There would be a lot of folks, I think, who would wonder why there is such an argument, if you will, about the nurse, for instance, who came over from Doctors Without Borders, who then New Jersey Governor Chris Christie said she is going to sit for 21 days in an isolation area. Now, of course, she's been released to her home in Maine. But there are many people who feel, isn't this just smart if you don't know what's happening? If there have been so many things that have happened and so many mistakes that have been made, or else at least not, maybe not mistakes, but just not knowing, isn't this just the right thing to do now?
I think there's a difference between the people that are actively responding to this outbreak, who understand all of the issues and understand how it's transmitted and understand how to protect themselves, versus the general American public that really doesn't understand how exposures occur, or at least they have no confidence in the direction that they're getting from CDC. But as she herself indicated and Doctors Without Borders indicated, she was following the appropriate protocols. And I see nothing wrong with her being restricted to her home. But you know, the issue with all of that is are these people going to comply with those requirements when they come home? And certainly we expect our healthcare workers to do that. But I think that is where some of the fear comes in for the general public.
Doesn't that at least come down to what happened in Dallas? Because we're finding out now that the gentleman who came in who died of Ebola, he did not tell the truth from the first minute that he came in to the emergency room. He didn't tell them that he might have been in contact with somebody who could have been suffering from Ebola. So doesn't that bring in something that even the CDC, they just can't get their hands on and they can't regulate? People still have got to tell the truth. And the healthcare professionals have got to be believing the truth from the very first moment. That in itself seems nearly impossible.
Well, yeah, you know, sort of all of these recommendations go out the window when people are not being honest. So, I mean, there is a challenge with that, especially. But you can't issue guidelines or regulations based on people who would not be telling the truth, because I think the problem is you're not going to get healthcare workers wanting to go to these outbreaks to respond if they think they're going to come home and they're going to be, you know, treated like they have done something wrong and put them in isolation, versus treating them with respect and, you know, doing active monitoring to make sure that they are not, you know, the American public has faith in that system. I think the direct active monitoring will help allay a lot of the fears, and you're taking it out of the hands of somebody who you may think is not being truthful about their signs or symptoms of the disease.
All right, now 15 seconds. Do you think the CDC went far enough?
I think they did, but I think the problem is there's still a lot of room for states to implement what they think is appropriate. So you may find differences from state to state. And I think that will, again, be another challenge for the general public to put their hands around.
All challenges. After the break with Debra Sharpe, the American military takes a lead in not only protecting soldiers, but testing for Ebola. That's coming up next, right here on MidPoint.